Hello, we are Bridget, Amelia, and Lily, and for our race, religion, and social justice class with Dr. Lewicka, we researched religion, sexual violence, and incarceration.
So we asked three questions when we were researching. The first one, what does research say about sexual violence statistics to those who have been incarcerated? The second one is, how does the trauma of sexual violence contribute to certain behaviors of those incarcerated? And our third one was, what roles has religion played in perpetuating rape culture slash sexual violence statistics?
So first of all, we want to lay out a few disclaimers. We want to acknowledge that people of any gender or any religious background can experience childhood sexual abuse or sexual violence. However, our particular research will focus primarily on the experiences of young girls and especially those that have been incarcerated. We also acknowledge that this is a sensitive topic, so please don't hesitate to stop this presentation at all or take a break if you need one. Our goal is to bring together people to combat rape culture and sexual violence in our communities.
So the first question is all about the research that we did for statistics for girls who have been incarcerated in sexual violence to show that this is a problem. So to start out, 1 in 4 American girls will experience some form of sexual violence by the age of 18. That includes every American girl, girls who've been incarcerated and not incarcerated. And nearly half of female rape survivors were victimized before the age of 18. Half of female delinquents reported some form of childhood sexual assault. Female delinquents are 2 to 3 times more likely to have experienced childhood sexual assault compared to non-incarcerated women. In a 2009 study of delinquent girls in South Carolina, 81% reported a history of sexual violence and 42% reported dating violence. One prison system found youth girls' rate of sexual abuse is 4 times higher than boys in juvenile justice. For girls, it was 31%, and for boys, it was 7%, which is part of the reason why we've decided to focus on girls' sexual abuse than boys. Another study has shown that sexual abuse is one of the strongest predictors of a girl in their recidivism and if they will commit a crime again or not. And it has a greater impact on that than behavioral problems and prior justice involvement. Another thing to note is that the United States is one of the top 3 destination countries for human trafficking, and the other two are Mexico and the Philippines. And girls do experience other things in their home as well as sexual abuse. For example, those who have experienced sexual abuse in a Florida study, 40% also experienced emotional abuse in the home, 80% also experienced physical abuse, and 40% had a family member with a substance problem. So they are experiencing sexual abuse and many other things as well.
All right, so we are next going to look at how does trauma of sexual violence contribute to certain delinquent behaviors. And first, we're going to focus on the neurological development and how childhood sexual abuse contributes to that. Multiple studies have shown that when a child experiences sexual abuse, this will lead to a delay in their development, such as taking in sensory information. They're not able to have the same emotional control. Cognitive information doesn't go in as the same. And so this all allows for delinquent behavior to increase. Specifically, it attacks the frontal lobe, which is responsible for the decision-making process of the brain. It has shown that there's a less blood flow that goes into it, therefore having a worse decision-making ability. We can also see that these individuals are in a consistent state of heightened awareness. So they're always in a fight or flight mode due to activity of the temporal lobes. This also will cause trauma if they're constantly on edge, if they're constantly having this extreme stress on them, they're going to act impulsively, they're going to act irrationally, leading to more violence or to what we consider delinquent behaviors. And then we can also see that poor neurotransmitter communications also occurs. So even when they are getting these stimuli, they're having delays in receiving the information or processing, understanding it, again, leading to impulsiveness. So all of these developments are setting these kids behind because of this abuse experienced early on in life. And so that leads us to, as they grow up, how are they coping with this sexual trauma? And it's been found that these girls are more likely to self inhibit and they're going to self-silence. So this is when they are lacking to fill their own needs, they are lacking an expression of oneself, they try to avoid conflict, they try to internalize their own emotions, therefore growing a little bit more angry. They also tend to gravitate towards other troubled peers. And with that, these girls who we're specifically talking about are 3 times more likely to run away from home, trying to get away from their abuser, trying to get away from the situation that they're in. Once they leave from home, this can lead to stealing, using drugs, and other dangerous behaviors in order to survive. And from that, we can see that that girls typically who have committed a violent crime are 4 times more likely to have experienced some sort of childhood sexual abuse. So it creates this huge cycle of trauma and delinquent behavior. We see that the child experiences sexual abuse that leads to a decrease in brain development, poor decision making, poor impulsivity control, emotional distress. That leaves them to leave their home, survive on the street. Some girls turn to prostitution in order to gain money, therefore, perpetrating the cycle. They'll develop self-destructive tendencies and engage in risky behaviors. And that can all lead to a development of poor mental health. So they'll experience PTSD, anxiety, personality disorders. And finally, these girls can also possibly become pregnant with a child to be born into these rough situations, just continuing a cycle of abuse.
So that brings us to our third research question, which is what role has religion played in perpetuating rape culture and sexual violence statistics? So let's first kind of define some things. Rape culture draws from popular and traditional gender body norms, images, and narratives that encourage people to view female bodies as sexual objects for men. These same cultures actually shame women who are not feminine enough. We find that people also who believe rape culture also tend to have beliefs leading to purity culture. And purity culture is something that teaches strict adherence to sexual abstinence prior to heterosexual marriage. Um, these things on the surface don't seem like they would have anything to do with each other, but they've actually been shown to exist kind of consistently. In one study, 9 women of color were surveyed on their experiences being exposed to purity culture, and they found that these women feel more pressure, societal pressures to conform to purity culture, and they feel more shame when they're unable to conform. This also occurs because their femininity is being compared to white femininity as well, which leads to more cycles of shame, and guilt and negative feelings. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a biblical story, the story of Tamar. She was raped by her half brother, and when she goes to her brother for help, he eventually does get revenge for what happened to her, but it's not right away. The first thing he does is he tells her to be quiet, to never tell anyone about this. She ends up living in his home, living an isolated life where she is shunned and shamed. Tamar's father, David, doesn't reprimand Amnon, doesn't help his daughter. She ends up living a pretty lonely and lonely life dealing with the traumatic events. So This isn't the only biblical story surrounding sexual violence. There's the story of Susanna. There are many more in Genesis that contain these themes of silencing women's voices and threatening them with sexual violence if they don't comply with men's wishes. There is a theme that when one is raped, one dies because they no longer have a part of them that was once sacred. This goes into the idea of purity culture, like they lose something. And this narrative can subject them to a lot of internalized self-hatred and pain. So we're going to talk about what do we do from here. Obviously, we want to heal and intervene with these girls. There are many different ways we can do this. Some of them do involve religious solutions, and some of them don't necessarily.
So the first thing I'm going to talk about is just healing the girls themselves, not necessarily involving religion, but just the girls that have been incarcerated and been through sexual trauma. And girls do need trauma-informed and gender-specific healthcare to improve their well-being over time and reduce their likelihood of committing another crime. And research does show that if a girl returns home after her release and the system failed to address the underlying abuse, she is at a high risk of going through that abuse again. And a Florida study examined girls after release and found that those who received mental health care services were 37% less likely to reoffend. And 2 years after their release, the girls who had the mental health services had reduced rates of offending again compared to girls who didn't. And another thing to note is that state laws and delinquency codes should define children under the age of 18 who engage in commercial sex acts as victims of trafficking. They should not persecute these children for, engaging in desperation sex and things like that. They need to heal these children and not punish them. And of course, mental health services are so important and need to be in residential programs for delinquent adolescent girls and should focus on healing these girls and focus on their family roles, developing relationship boundaries, developing a healthy self-concept, and learning coping strategies. So a way to help heal these girls is in a group setting, and part of a group setting is mutual aid and psychoeducation. And mutual aid is about sharing information, mutual support between each other, mutual demand, problem solving, solving each other's problems, which then end up solving your own because you likely have shared experiences in the same problems. And group members act to just help an individual get through something that they're going through, which then help their own selves. And psychoeducation is educational materials related to the problems the girls are facing and facilitating discussions about the material and problems that relate to each of them. And they gain knowledge and understanding about their behavior, feelings, and emotions that will lead them to be able to change their behaviors. So two groups that I looked at that did do mutual aid and psychoeducation was the Esphega Girls Group and the Putting Pieces Back Together group. The Esphega Girls Group was a 12-week long, 2-hour every week psychoeducation group led by women for delinquent girls that had experienced past sexual abuse. And they addressed the harms that these girls had been through. And the girls did say that they experienced a sense of relief that they could talk without feeling like they were going to get into trouble for anything that they said. And leaders made sure to use respectful, supportive, and active listening techniques throughout the sessions. And this group did show some improvement in the girls' mental health. The Putting the Pieces Back Together group was another group done in a delinquency setting, and it was mainly about sex trafficking in the young girls. And the components of this group consisted of increasing knowledge about minor sex trafficking, because some of the girls didn't realize that they had been through sex trafficking, reducing shame and addressing stigma, fostering mutual aid in managing strong emotions. And this program reduced shame by promoting discussion about stigmatized topics like parents pimping their own children, trading sex to get basic needs met, or engaging in risky sexual behavior as a result of desperation. And they normalize these situations that are so common to the victims in these groups. And so they would no longer feel isolated in shame. And we've learned that shame is a big indicator of whether a person will commit a crime.
So next we're gonna kind of deconstruct rape myths and intrinsic religiosity and how those relate to each other. There was one study where they decided to test, if the acceptance of purity culture beliefs coincided with the acceptance of rape myths. And they found that yes, as purity culture beliefs increased, so did the acceptance of rape myths. And rape myths can mean anything. Some examples are, well, she shouldn't have been wearing that, or, earlier she seemed into it, or oh, she shouldn't have gotten so drunk. However, they found that intrinsic religiosity ameliorated this relationship. The finding was particularly pronounced among individuals with lower levels of intrinsic religiosity. So, what does that mean? Well, intrinsic religiosity uses a, a broader framework to view religion in their lives. They find that they've internalized more of their religious views, and it applies to a lot more areas of their lives. These people also really believe in loving thy neighbor and showing compassion for people who are suffering. So it would make sense that people who don't also have these biblical attitudes would find the acceptance of rape myths more tolerable. So they found that people with high intrinsic religiosity, they had mitigation for victim blaming rape myths. They found that there was a reduction in victim blaming attitudes that are related to purity culture.
Finally, we're going to look at how religion and Christianity can specifically help these girls and any other sexual abuse survivor. First, in the church, we need to think and look at how has the Bible and how has religious teachings been the perpetrator of rape culture, and how has it allowed complacency towards perpetrators of sexual violence and or the silencing of victims. By acknowledging the ways that the church has played and had a big impact in history and through current society, we can take the first steps into helping these victims seek the help that they need either in the community or within the church. Second, we need to start naming what sexual violence includes. So, how do we define what it is? How do we not avoid the victim's story? How do we make sure that they are feeling safe and heard and everything like that? What does that entail with sexual violence? Third, we need to believe victims and tell them that we believe them. If they are able and willing to come forward and say, this is my story and this is what happened, the first thing we should say is, I believe you. Fourth, we need to address the severity of the situation. We can't push it under the rug or deny that it only happens very rarely. It happens more often than we think. And in the church specifically, we need to help provide a safe space for these victims to come forward and believe that they will have some sort of community supporting them. Fifth, we in the church and religious leaders specifically need to have better counseling options. So providing training on the mental health of people who have experienced sexual abuse, providing training on where to go if you do have one of these situations, providing options of different care, of they need a place to stay. What are ways that these religious leaders and people in the church can support and get help for these victims? And then finally, number 6, and this one is going to take some work as well, but clarity on when to report situations. Because most religious leaders aren't mandated reporters, many are confused on when to seek help. Police involvement or rape and abuse crisis centers, anything like that. They have a hard time knowing where to get involved with the victim. So having the ability to have the conversations as to where we can go from here. And in the church, we also need to be willing to host some of these organizations that we mentioned earlier, like these support groups for the girls, provide a space, kind of like a AA meeting where these victims or victims' families can get together and grieve and talk about the ways that this has affected them and how they're moving forward. And as a church, we can hold that space and hold that availability for these people. And with that, these are some of the sources. We'll include a list as well, but thank you so much for listening to this conversation. We hope that you've learned a lot, and we are very grateful for your time. Thank you so much. We need to take a look at the ways that, and in the church,